This is one of the most rewarding times of the year. All the hard work of planning and planting, weeding and watering and caring for these crops all season comes to a point and we see if it's the abundant harvest that we had hoped for. These storage crops are what our family relies on to feed us through the winter months and into next year's growing season. So how did it all pan out, and what are the positive and difficult lessons that we learned along the way? There are always ups and downs, so join us for a week of fall harvesting on the homestead.
Oh yeah! Check those bad boys out. Not too bad.
I'll pick some big boys and rice. I'll pick some rice. They have to come up really easily. They have to be easy.
When we moved onto this property several years ago, we had dreams of living off the land, but really didn't know what that would look like practically. I think we had a pretty decent grasp of it from the animal perspective. We had raised chickens for eggs and meat, already had our family milk cow, and worked at a farm that raised sheep and other animals. So we knew producing our own meat and dairy was doable. But when it came to produce, we had minimal experience preserving what we grew beyond the summer harvest, let alone growing it at a scale that would meet our growing family's needs through the long winter months. That's when we were introduced to the world of storage crops, and our concept of gardening was turned upside down. When we previously lived in the suburbs, we had begun growing some storage crops, roots like carrots and beets, some winter squash and potatoes, but not nearly enough for year-round food. Moving on to our 5 acres opened up so much possibility to us. We set aside a 1/4 acre section where we established a 30 fruit tree orchard, raised chickens for meat on pasture and chicken tractors, and grow long rows of storage crops like potatoes, the 3 sisters, which are corn, beans, and winter squash, and this year we also added sweet potatoes into the mix.
Juicy! This one's really juicy, Mom.
Our kitchen garden has also shifted to be heavily weighted towards storage crops. Yes, there are some greens and other things that we have for fresh eating, but the majority of what we grow are vegetables that store well beyond the growing season. We are thankful that where we live in the Midwest, it's been a great year for growing. Plenty of rain, sun, and no major weather incidents to throw a wrench in gardening plans. With consistent rain and a warmer than average spring, it's really been an ideal year for apples. We planted the majority of our orchard in 2021, so we are just 3 years in now and are celebrating our first sizable apple harvest. While most of our fruit trees aren't mature enough yet to produce fruit, we had a few trees that were loaded.
Can you touch it? There we go, you got it.
Mommy,
Oh, there's one.
We purchased all of our fruit trees from Fedco in Maine, and while it was an upfront cost, it was also an investment that we've been really happy we made early on. The Liberty apple is a hardy, pest-resistant variety that's known for fruiting early, and that's been our experience. Without using any sprays or doing anything for pests, this tree produced abundant, beautiful apples. Apples are a great crop when it comes to storage, especially certain varieties. The apples that we harvested this year are more early season varieties, so we're preserving them by canning them for the year ahead, but we are really looking forward to when our storage apples like the Black Oxford and Northern Spy begin fruiting so that we can store plenty of apples for fresh eating all winter long. You know apples are ripe and ready for picking when they pull off the tree really easily. If you give them a solid tug and they're still wanting to hold on, you probably want to wait and check back again later.
We used to grow much more variety in our kitchen garden, but every year we have simplified more and more, growing less variety and more of what we love, and specifically things that store well.
Shall we harvest these bad boys?
What we got?
Little tiny onion.
Here we are harvesting rows of onions, carrots, and beets. When you grow onions for storage, it's best to wait and harvest them when their greens have died back. Then leave them at room temperature in a place where they get plenty of airflow to cure for a few weeks before storing. Curing helps to harden their skins for better storage capabilities. There are several good storage varieties of onions that you can grow. Our favorite that we have the most experience with is the yellow of Parma onion, but to be completely honest, it was not our best year for onions this year. We planted them late and they just never really seemed to fully develop. And lesson learned, we should have turned off the drip lines in this row of our drip irrigation system sooner to let them dry out once those plants had died back, because some of the areas were oversaturated and we had to throw several in the compost. We'll have some onions to last us for a few months, but not enough to store for the whole year ahead. And onions are definitely one of those things that we want to plant more of for next year. Right next to our onions, we had our carrots. And the big thing about growing carrots for storage is that the large, more substantial carrots tend to store much better than the smaller ones, which tend to dry out and get soft faster. Early in the season, something must have gotten into our garden and eaten the tops off of like the first third of our carrots, so we weren't surprised when we harvested those and they were pretty small and puny. But as we went past that initial third, they got much larger, like the carrots that we were looking for to store long term. Hey, look at that beauty. We grew a variety called Scarlet Nantes carrots, and to store them long term, we cut the greens about 1 inch above the carrot top and then store the carrots unwashed in plastic bags in the fridge. I put all of the small ones in a separate bag that we're going to eat first, and then we'll have the larger ones to enjoy throughout the winter. It's important not to wash your produce when you want to store it long term because the moisture will ruin its ability to store well. And the leafy tops we cut off make a great treat for the cows.
You like carrots? Gonna gobble those up too?
Beauties. Oh, that one really went down there. Check this bad boy out. Woo! Whoa! Oh, this is like the prettiest one yet. Check that out. No blemishes. Beets are similar to carrots in that after harvesting you cut the greens off, and we also store these in plastic bags in the fridge. We were so happy with the beets this year, and this is the first year that I can remember that we basically had no pest or rodent pressure eating at our beets. They were some of the largest beets we'd ever grown, which is great for storage. We love the Detroit dark red beets. That deep red color means that they have more nutrition than the more pale pink beets. Detroit dark reds also store really well, and so we're excited for roasted beets and using them in baking for the year ahead. Did you know that pureed beets actually go really well with chocolate? We always grow several heads of cabbage, primarily for turning into sauerkraut to have for the full year. We'll harvest them in the fall and then store them in the fridge for at least a few weeks to a couple of months. Once we clean up the garden and all the outside work slows for the winter, I'll turn all of that cabbage into sauerkraut. And sauerkraut's a way of preserving the cabbage so that it will store for many, many months. My favorite variety has always been the red calabash cabbage, but we also grew some beautiful green cabbages this year that actually did better than our red cabbages, so we might start growing more of those in the future.
Crunch that whole beet. Now.
We'll find it. It's a jungle in here. And the best crops to harvest are always the volunteer plants that show up in unexpected places.
Like a Cinderella pumpkin.
Big one and a beauty. Wow.
Can you pick it up?
A beauty. And it's heavy.
It's heavy.
We didn't plant any pumpkins this year, but we had a few pumpkin plants grow and produced the biggest pumpkin that we've ever grown. And our kids are so excited to carve it this fall.
Monster. All right. Yeah.
The rest of our storage crops to harvest are all in that quarter-acre garden where we were harvesting apples before. It's actually a bit earlier than usual for us to be harvesting many of the crops growing here. Most years we haven't started harvesting until mid-October, and here we are launching in at the end of September. But we have some family commitments the first couple weeks of October that we'll be very tied up with, so we wanted to get a head start to not leave everything for after. And while not everything is fully ready for harvest yet, with it being such an early and productive growing season where we're at, there is a good amount that's ready for harvest.
So you see this one here? It's still, feel that. It feels kind of leathery and moist. Okay, that one's not dry yet, but then you see these and they're like crinkly, like a, you know, they're very kind of crunchy. Yeah, so these ones are dry. So these are the ones we want to pick. These ones need some more time. So we'll leave these ones on, okay?
Oh, like these?
Yep, these ones look good. So you'll notice they're kind of more of like this pink color when they're not dry yet.
Green.
Green, yep, green, you're right.
Or like, maybe like, Mommy, can I pick purple?
Yeah.
Beans are usually the first of the Three Sisters crops to be ready to harvest, so we weren't surprised to find most of the beans ready to go. You know it's time to harvest beans when the outer shell dries out and it gets hard and crunchy like a crispy leaf. Ours turned a brown or light tan color, and the vines that the beans grow on will often die back and dry out too. In our case, many of the vines were still pretty green, so not all the beans were ready to pull just yet. Any that were purple or green and still had a soft outer shell, we left to harvest later. We've grown a few different bean varieties in the past. This year we only grew the Cherokee Trail of Tears beans. They're a pretty standard black bean that dries and stores well, and we've just had really good luck with them. In fact, this was probably our most abundant bean year yet, and we'll probably end up with several gallons of beans once we get through harvesting all of them. Cherokee Trail of Tears are also pole beans, which is what you want to look for when growing the Three Sisters. Pole beans will climb up the corn stalks really well, as opposed to a bush bean that stays closer to the ground. We got our seed for these from Seed Savers Exchange, which is one of our favorite seed suppliers. Beans are something that we have a love-hate relationship with. They're a great source of protein, and our whole family really loves eating them, plus they're just really fun to grow. But they're also really labor intensive when it comes to harvest time. Not only is it pretty tedious to find and pluck all the beans off, but you also need to go through and shell each bean pod, which is the process of opening up the shell and removing the beans. None of this is hard, just tedious and time-consuming work that can be a bit challenging to work up the motivation for, especially after the weather has turned and you remember the many bags of beans sitting in storage that still need to be shelled. The next day was a rainy day that was much needed after a recent dry spell we've been going through. Since most storage crops really need to be dry when you harvest them to preserve best, we took a break from harvesting and got caught up on some cooking and other work we needed to take care of inside the house. These forced days off in the middle of harvest season are always welcome with how physically taxing it all can be. We wanted to give our corn, beans, and squash an extra day to dry out, so the next day we decided to make our potato harvest day. Normally after a full day of rain, the ground might be too saturated and muddy to dig potatoes, but with how dry it had been leading up to that, we knew it wouldn't be a problem.
Potatoes might be our favorite thing to grow. They require minimal work after they're planted, have grown really abundantly for us, and it's easy to save seed potatoes to grow them year after year. Plus, they're just super fun to harvest. It's like a treasure hunt. One of the downsides to it being such a prolific growing season is that the weeds came in stronger than ever too. We did an earlier 2 full rounds of weeding here, but as you can see, the weeds are still pretty thick. So step 1 is going in, clearing out as many weeds as possible, and pulling back the lines of drip tape so that we can dig up the potatoes. We didn't do any mulching with the potatoes or sweet potatoes this year, but we definitely want to reconsider that for next year. It's always seemed a bit trickier with potatoes to get the timing right since you don't really know when or where they'll pop up, so if you have any tips on that, we'd love to hear it.
All right, potato crew, you guys ready?
Right.
He's trying to get out.
We're getting closer.
Way over here. Potato. Coming.
Potatoes. So if you do it.
Whoa. Forked it.
Got it.
Oh, that's a juicy kind.
Look at that big fat worm.
Whoa.
Oh,
I might have chopped it in half.
that's weird.
Daddy's a little wild with the pitchfork. Watch out, everyone.
Put
Feels a little softer here now. Hey.
Potato.
potato.
First one to spot it.
Potato. Potato.
We dig up potatoes the old-fashioned way, by hand with a pitchfork. We literally just start at one end of our 150-foot long row and dig up approximately a 1 foot wide swath at a time.
Woo. Red potatoes.
Dirt went flying. Getting a ride.
And I'm going to find a spot.
And it's really fun that our son loves to follow behind us as we go and collect all the worms he can to feed our chickens. This year there were a ton of worms in the soil, so it kept him busy and our chickens were really happy.
Oh, I see all those worms on top.
Yeah. Here comes one. Here they are.
One of our biggest takeaways this year was how important it is to plant your potatoes in loose, well broken up soil. We widened our rows a bit this year to plant 2 rows of potatoes side by side versus the single row down the middle that we've done in the past. Jim knew that our tiller was struggling a bit earlier in the season when planting, especially at the end of the rows. The early yields, especially those at the end of the row, weren't that great because the soil was hard and not broken up very well. Now that we have a small tractor, we're considering getting a tiller attachment for it, which would give us much more consistent results. In this row, about 100 feet are planted in potatoes and then 50 feet are in sweet potatoes. We like to grow a few different potato varieties. We grow a red potato, which is a great all-around potato for roasting or soups or stews. Adirondack Blues are a purple potato that we like for the extra nutrients that they provide, as well as just the fun, deep purple color. Corollas are a yellow potato, and they are our favorite. They're such a creamy, delicious, buttery potato. And then roughly half of the potatoes that we grow are Elbas, which are a white potato that's just really good for storage. The Elbas will still be firm well into spring, while all the rest of the potatoes are starting to shrivel and get soft. We're harvesting the red, purple, and some of the Corolla potatoes now. All of the plants on those have already died back, so they're ready to be harvested. We'll wait to harvest the rest of the Corolla potatoes as well as all of the Elbas until later in October or possibly even November when those plants have had a chance to die back. They're still green and growing strong now, so they're not ready to harvest yet.
Oh, check it out.
Oh, yeah. There's the potatoes.
All the potatoes.
Look at that.
One of the things that we've learned over the years harvesting potatoes is that a good pitchfork is a must. I think we broke 2 wood-handled pitchforks in one season previously, and we knew it was time to upgrade. This all-metal pitchfork made it on Jim's Christmas list that year, and it's always up for the challenge of digging out as many potatoes as we can throw at it. Digging out potatoes by hand definitely makes them one of the most physically demanding and time-consuming crops to harvest, especially on your back. Jim had actually tweaked his back a bit the week before, and so we weren't sure if harvesting potatoes was going to happen at all. Thankfully, he made it through better than we thought, but we were both physically spent by the end of the day.
Let's do a harvesting lesson here. So, rule 1, try not to step on the squash if we can help it. So, look for the squashes. You okay? You want to get up?
Wet butt.
Yeah.
There
you go. Alright, so this is a good one, not green. Ideally, we're going to want to try to keep the stem on it, so try not to pull the stem off. Squash. So that one's not right.
There's a form of gardening out there called chaos gardening that more or less abandons the straight rows and neat and tidy ways that gardening typically looks like today. While this quarter-acre area isn't technically chaos gardening, it feels pretty chaotic this time of year. We often get asked how we manage the grass in this space. Early in the season, while the plants are still young, we're able to mow the grassed areas down and keep it all in line. But inevitably, you hit the point of no return when the squash and even things like the sweet potatoes start sprawling, and you just need to leave it all be and let it grow wild. So with the long grasses, it's sort of like walking through a minefield in here. There are squash plants growing everywhere with big, beautiful squash growing on them that are completely hidden in the grass cover. It's super fun for the kids to go through and find them, sort of like a treasure hunt, but at the same time, we're constantly having to remind them to not trample the squash plants and do their best to avoid stepping on them, and us too. This is another disadvantage to harvesting on the earlier side this year. Often when we're harvesting squash, most of the plants have died back already and we don't have to worry about stepping on them so much. But this year, while there are plenty of ripe squash ready to be harvested, the vines are still plenty alive with lots of young and unripe squash still forming.
This is a long squash.
That's a big one. Great. Let's walk around this tree so we don't step on the squash.
We counted around 45 squash that we pulled in so far, and we estimate that's roughly 1/3 of the total squash we'll get this year. For whatever reason, we noticed this year that the majority of the squash plants spread to one side of the Three Sisters row and less to the other. So we started on the lesser side, and once we turned the corner, we realized with how dense the plants had grown in, plus with the still alive ground cover from the sweet potatoes coming from the other row, it was best just to hold on the rest of the squash for now until more of the plants had died back. We used to grow different varieties of winter squash, but we kept coming back to butternut being our favorite in terms of good yield, appreciating the taste and texture for cooking and baking, and its ability to store well. We've had butternut squashes store fine for a full year in the past. So now we just stick to growing these, and this can also be important if you plan on saving seeds so the varieties don't cross-pollinate.
You guys remember how to harvest corn? No? Okay. Alright, so grab the stalk with one hand, and then with your other hand, you're going to do the plucking. So you kind of bend it down. So hold this firm, bend down, and then just rip it off. And this one's even got a little bonus, but I don't think it's going to be, well, we'll throw it in there anyways, but there it is. Alright, give it a good tug, and it should just rip right off. There you go. Hold it here and give it a firm yank. Firm. Hoo-yah! Give it a rip. Give it Darth Vader strength. Rip. You got it. Oh yeah.
I got two.
Yep, so hold that stalk.
Oh, Lucky, don't stick right there. That is so cool.
He's a beauty.
This cross-pollinating is also true of corn, so we only grow one variety. This last year we grew Oaxacan green dent corn, which produces these beautiful green kernels. Last year we grew popcorn, which was really fun. The only problem was that it only grew to be about 4 feet tall instead of the 7+ feet tall of the Oaxacan green dent corn. So our beans didn't have the space to trellis up, and it just didn't work great in this Three Sisters system. The corn needs to dry out for a couple of weeks after harvesting before shelling the corn to store long term. In this whole kernel form, it can store for years. We typically grind it to use as cornmeal, or it would be great for feeding to animals. The last thing we harvested before we wrapped up this week were sweet potatoes. This is a new one for us, and it's still a bit early to be harvesting them, but we at least wanted to do a few feet to try a few and see what we were working with. Sweet potatoes do best in warm, tropical climates and are not ideal for our Zone 5B, but we wanted to give them a try. Thankfully, it's been a warm summer with no early frosts, so they've been looking great with their leaves growing out like crazy. We planted 100 slips in a double-wide 50-foot row. The variety we planted was called Bayou Bells, and we ordered them from Sprout Mountain Farms. We only harvested a few feet for now to get a gauge of how they were looking, and we were pleasantly surprised. We had several big, beautiful sweet potatoes, along with many thin ones. Since the plants are still growing and looking very healthy, we want to give them some more time to continue to grow, and we'll be super excited to see what the rest of the section reveals. We harvested these similarly to how we harvest our potatoes, but we ran up against two things. One, they seem to grow deeper than regular potatoes do, and two, they tend to grow long and lean, so many snapped in half when we were pulling them out. We still have many rows of sweet potatoes to go in the weeks ahead and aren't sure if this is the best way to go about it. So if anyone has tips on best practices for harvesting sweet potatoes, we're all ears.
Check those bad boys out.
While we still have a decent amount of harvesting ahead of us, it feels so good to see everything paying off and our storage shelves filling up with the food that will feed our family in the coming winter months. If round 1 is harvesting, round 2 is storage. We didn't get into our methods of storing food this time, but look for a follow-up on that in a month or so. The other great thing about growing foods that are delicious and nutritious is that they're usually really beautiful too, and you can get some pretty sweet fall decorations out of it.